I've seen and heard a lot of silly things from people and groups that are against an Article 5 convention, but this is a doozy. This person testifies in front of legislative committees and claims that none of the framers believed they had the authority to propose the Constitution. He has even offered anyone that can provide just one quote from any of them stating that they had that authority $10,000. Well, I can't refuse such an easy opportunity to make 10 grand, so let's see how honest this person is and whether he will honor his word. What do you think is about to happen? I'm your Huckleberry. Why, Robert Brown. Looks like somebody's going to expose your lies. Welcome to All Things Article 5, where we do a deep dive into the Constitution's amending provision to break through all of the misinformation out there and get to the truth. Whether you're an Article 5 activist like myself, or maybe just new to the subject and want to learn more, this is the place to be, and I promise you won't want to miss an episode. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you're notified when the new videos drop, and please share it with others. Sit back and join me as we go into the past to learn from it, get engaged in the present so that we can change the future. Now, as you heard in my introduction, there is a lot of crazy things being said against the process of the state legislatures proposing an amendment. Everything from an Article 5 convention is a con, which is a constitutional convention that can rewrite the Constitution, that Congress makes all the rules and appoints the delegates to the convention, that the ratification process can be changed, blah, 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 blah. Robert Brown goes around the country on behalf of the John Birch Society and has actually offered to pay anyone that can provide one quote from a single delegate of the federal convention that claimed they had the authority to do what they did by proposing the Constitution 10 grand.
Get one more category here. Witnesses that declared they had been granted the power to make these changes. This should be interesting, right? I have a problem with this one, though. Can't find them. Ever. You need to call missing persons or something, because those founding fathers are just missing from the record. When this debate came up in the Federal Convention in 1787, one side saying we don't have the power and shouldn't proceed, the other side saying, yeah, you're right, we probably don't have the power, but we must proceed. Not one delegate ever stood up and said, here's my commission, and it says we have the power. Up till now, for the last 3 years, I've been issuing this challenge. I've even put, you remember that missing persons slide? Find me the delegate in the 1787 convention who rose and said, we have the authority in our delegate commissions. I've issued a $10,000 bounty on that quote. No one's offered the money yet. No one's come up and said, hey, pay me. I found the delegate that said we have the authority in our state commissions to create this national form of government, because it doesn't exist.
Here's the document that he has provided committee members to support this outlandish claim. Now, if you are a constitutional history buff, you will find it quite obvious what he has done. Basically, he is taking all anti-federalist quotes, and he's taken quotes out of context from the Article 5 or Constitution supporters just to make a pretext out of it. And we are going to debunk this and prove that they did have authority, they knew they had the authority, and hopefully we'll make 10 grand in the process. Today, we are actually looking at one of the most prominent framers of our Constitution, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, one of the quotes he uses. Now, let me give you a short bio on James Wilson. He was elected twice to the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a major participant in drafting the United States Constitution. He was actually one of the 6 original justices appointed by George Washington to the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm going to start with this funny anecdote Wilson shared in his book, The Law, which contains his writings. Comments he made at the Federal Convention and at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, among other writings. Quote, The business, we are told, which was entrusted to the late convention, was merely to amend the present Articles of Confederation. This observation has been frequently made and has often brought to my mind a story that is related of a Mr. Pope, which it is well known was not a little deformed. It was customary with him to use this phrase, quote, "God mend me," unquote, when any little accident happened. One evening, a link boy, that's a boy kind of lighting the way, was lighting him along, and coming to a gutter, the boy jumped nimbly over it. Mr. Pope called to him to turn, adding, "God mend me." The arch rogue, turning to light him, looked at him and replied, "God mend you? He would sooner make half a dozen new ones." This would apply to the present Confederation, for it would be easier to make another than to amend this, unquote. In regard to the proposing a new system of government at the convention, quote, he saw no incompatibility between the national and state governments, provided the latter were restrained to certain local purposes, unquote. He also said, quote, the aim of the convention was to form a system of good and efficient government on the more extensive scale of the United States. Now, here's the quote on Mr. Brown's sheet of paper by James Wilson that he claims is him saying that they exceed their authority, which I will prove is completely wrong. Let me read it to you. Quote, the Federal Convention did not act at all upon the powers given to them by the states, but they proceeded upon original principles, and having framed a constitution which they thought would promote the happiness of their country, they have submitted it to their consideration, who may either adopt or reject it as they please, unquote. As you can probably see, Brown used this quote because he thinks Wilson's comment of, quote, did not act at all upon the power given to them, unquote, means that they exceeded their powers, but that is not at all what Wilson is referring to, as I will demonstrate shortly. Before we do that, it is important for us to learn a term unfamiliar to Mr. Brown, because he gets most of his definitions from dictionaries published over 100 years after the adoption of the Constitution, which usually is just the opinion of the editor. Whereas we will be learning the language and the ideas from the framers themselves to determine the proper interpretation. And as you will see in this case, it is crystal clear. The term we are going to be reviewing is, quote, first principles, unquote, which is referring to the fountain of power coming from the people to ratify the Constitution. This was one of the major defects of the Articles of Confederation that several of the framers pointed out. Charles Pinckney, in his observation on the plan of the federal government, said this, quote, this opinion of our Confederation, that it ought to have been formed by a convention of the states expressly delegated for that purpose, and ratified by the authority of the people. This indispensable power it wants, and is, therefore, without the validity a federal constitution ought certainly to have had. In most of the states, it has nothing more, strictly speaking, than a legislative authority, and might therefore to be said in some measure to be under the control of the state legislatures, unquote. James Madison, in his essay, Vices of the Political System of the United States, said this, under the segment, Want of a Ratification by the People of the Articles of Confederation, quote, in some of the states, the Confederation is recognized by and forms a part of the Constitution. In others, however, it has received no other sanction than that of the legislative authority, unquote. And here's James Wilson on this subject at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. Quote, let us retain first principles. The people of the United States are now in the possession and exercise of their original rights. And while this doctrine is known and operates, we shall have a cure for every disease, unquote. We now see the great end which they proposed to accomplish. It was to frame for the consideration of their constituents one federal and national constitution, a constitution that would produce the advantages of good and prevent the inconveniences of bad government, a constitution whose benefits and energy would pervade the whole Union and bind and embrace the interest of every part, a constitution that would ensure peace, freedom, and happiness to the states and the people of America," unquote. Wilson was a strong advocate of the ratification by the people themselves. Now let's see what he said specifically in regard to the convention exceeding their powers, because this is what Robert Brown is trying to point out, and he's completely wrong, because this is what Wilson said, quote, "I come now to consider the last set of objections that are offered against the Constitution. It is urged that this is not such a system as was within the powers of the convention. They assume the power of proposing. I believe they might have made proposals without going beyond their powers. I think the late convention has done nothing beyond their powers. The fact is, they have exercised no power at all. And in point of validity, the Constitution proposed by them for the government of the United States claims no more than a production of the same nature would claim following from a private pen. It is laid before the citizens of the United States, unfettered by restraint. It is laid before them to be judged by the natural, civil, and political rights of men. By their fiat, it will become of value and authority. Without it, it will never receive the character or authenticity and power," unquote. So let's review the quote that is used by Brown now and see how it has a completely different meaning. We also need to take a look at the word, quote, "to act," to determine what Wilson means by this word. According to the Samuel Johnson Dictionary of 1755, the word act means to actuate, to put in motion, agency, the power of producing an effect. Now let's take a look at Wilson's quote in that context, and you will see a completely different understanding. Here it is. Quote, "It was observed in the convention that the federal convention had exceeded the powers given them by the several legislatures. But Mr. Wilson observed that however foreign the question was to the present business, he would place it in its proper light. The federal convention did not act at all upon the powers given to them by the states, but they proceeded upon original principles, and having framed a constitution which they thought would promote the happiness of their country, they have submitted it to their consideration, who may either adopt or reject it as they please," unquote. Here is his quote, and the $10,000 qualifying proof for Mr. Brown. Here it is, quote, "With regard to the power of the convention, he conceived himself authorized to conclude nothing, but to be at liberty to propose anything. In this particular, he felt himself perfectly indifferent to the two plans," unquote. The word conclude from the same dictionary meant to decide, to determine, to finish, as by final determination. What Brown is doing is lifting this out of context as though they exceeded their authority when in fact they did not even act upon that authority because all they could do was propose. And that's exactly what Wilson said. He had the power to propose anything. So did he change his mind? Of course not. What he said is that they could not, in the convention, conclude or act upon those powers because they wanted to let the people ratify it by returning to first principles. That is the proper context of this quote that Brown is hoping you do not catch. And he takes out of context and twists to try to get you to believe that they exceeded their authority. Okay, let's wrap this up. I have proven Robert Brown wrong by providing several quotes from James Wilson stating the following. Number one, the convention did not go beyond its powers. He had full authority to do exactly what he did, and he said it. Number two, his commission gave him authority to propose anything. again, which he clearly stated. Number 3, a resort to first principles to allow the people to act upon the Constitution is the only proper way to give it authority. And personally, I think this proof should include an additional $5,000 because I actually used one of the quotes that he misinterprets and twists. So, Robert, I'm not going to hold you to the extra $5,000 bonus, but there is your proof that James Wilson, a delegate to the Federal Convention, stated that he had the authority to propose anything, which is exactly what they did, and they resorted to first principles to allow the people to act upon it, to conclude the business, and to ratify the U.S. Constitution. Robert, I want to thank you for this opportunity to earn $10,000. I appreciate it, and I promise you I will spend the money wisely. I hate to take it from you and your family, but you're the one that asked for it. You put the challenge out there, so I decided to collect. Here's my Venmo account I created just for you. I look forward to the deposit. I understand you can't deposit $10,000 all at once. I think you got to do $2,000 a week, so that's okay. I can wait for that. There's no rush here. With all things Article 5, I'm Ken Quinn. Remember, experience must be our only guide. Fear will paralyze us. So fear not, have some fun, and let the truth prevail. Till next time. With all things Article 5, this is Ken Quinn. Remember. Let's start over.